Hello, my name is Zdorovtsov and I'm a Community Development Field Specialist with SDSU Extension. And today I'm going to talk about constructing raised beds for your school or community garden. Raised beds may not be absolutely necessary for your project, but there are some benefits to using them, as well as some things you may want to consider before you implement such a project. Raised beds will likely cost you more money. They have parts and pieces that you have to purchase versus just breaking ground. They can be a little bit more intimidating to put together versus just tilling the ground. Keep in mind, on one hand, they can be easier to maintain, yet you do have to water them more often because they're high and not lifted off the ground. They'll dry out more quickly. And so that frequent watering is required. But they'll have that cleaner look and that more aesthetic appearance than a garden can when it's in the ground. Also, if you're in a situation where you have possible soil contamination, you'll want to put in a raised bed because then you'll know that you've brought in safe soil to garden out of. Also, the raised bed allows for reduced compaction because it's up off the ground and children and people won't be tromping through the soil. So that will lead to better yields and production. The raised beds can take on a range of forms. There is the framed raised bed, which is pictured on the right, as well as the unframed or just a raised ground bed. The framed bed is basically a box where you're going to build and then fill it with soil. They can be as low as 6 to 8 inches or as tall as 38 inches. The framed are nice if you're dealing with a group of people that are needing handicap accessibility. It also creates that barrier or that wall for foot traffic, so they're great for when you're dealing with children, or if you have a perennial weed problem and you're trying to keep these perennial weeds from invading your bed. Again, they have that nice finished look. And again, you have to have that expense there, that funding to pay for all those parts. You have to construct this bed, so you may need a group of people to come together to help build these. And then they do need to be maintained and replaced as they break down. And you can do things to create good supportive beds, and I'll show some examples here to follow. To make your wooden frame, you basically cut your boards to your desired lengths, secure the corners with some kind of a decking screw, and then add your soil to it. You can see here the two examples, again, a tall bed and a lower bed. Now, if you look at the example of the unframed bed, what you're doing there, you can see that it's just soil that's been mounded up, and this is going to improve the drainage. It's cheaper than building a full raised bed because there's really no framing materials needing to be purchased, but you will have that physical labor of building those beds. And these work well, for intensive plantings. You can kind of plant on the mound and on all sides of them. Those sides can erode away, however, and they are more vulnerable to damage from the gardener and from the weeds that creep up on the sides. You have two options here. You can bring in soil and put it over the ground. You'll kind of want to mix that soil with the existing soil, but you could bring in compost or a soil mix there or aged manure to form those beds. And then again, thoroughly mix it with the underlying soil. Or you can excavate again 3 to 4 inches from the pathways to help build up this mound. And then make sure those mounds are about 24 inches wide, and then let that soil rest for a good week or two before you plant. Otherwise, you may find that the soil settles where you weren't expecting it to. All right, so now how big should your bed be? 4-foot multiples are usually what we work in, just because that's a lot of times what the lumber is available in, and then you'll reduce waste and not have to do as much sawing and cutting to get the beds where you want. But you could ultimately make them as long as you would like. The reach, though, is the big detail that you'll want to keep in mind. So most adult gardeners find it uncomfortable to reach farther than 3 feet to tend a bed. And with small children, you really don't want to have that reach any further than about 1.5 feet, so their little arms can get into the center of that bed. Also consider if this bed is going to be accessible from all sides. If this bed is up against a wall, then that reach needs to be kept in mind. You can't reach in more than 2.5 to 3 feet as an adult, and 1.5 feet again with a child. If it's accessible from all sides, so an adult garden bed could be easily 5 foot across. Again, the length now isn't as critical. It could be as long as you'd want. The big thing there is the length going to become a hindrance as far as just walking patterns? Are you going to have to walk around this big, long, 30-foot bed? That might become a little ridiculous. So usually we see these beds maybe 10-foot long, 12-foot long, somewhere in that range, so that it's easily moved around. You can see in the picture here, I just want to give you an example. This bed is 24 inches tall, and these are second graders. So you can see sort of the height there that these second graders are using. Those beds are 4 foot wide, and that's probably the max you would want to do with these children. Now, when dealing with wheelchair accessibility, the recommended height is 24 to 27 inches high. It's at a comfortable seated height. And so you could adapt that depending on your users, but that's about the recommended height there. And then again, if you're dealing with maybe an older population that would prefer to sit and garden, again, keep that same height in mind, a sitting situation where they could sit alongside the garden and not have to bend too far when they can reach. Now, if you're dealing with an audience that prefers to stand, then you're going to want to put it at waist height, which would be about 30 inches or taller, but adapt it to the average height of your participants. Now, when you're just trying to deter high traffic, a lower bed may be all you need. In this situation, maybe you're running along a walkway or a path area where people are walking around that area. You may need something that's just 10 to 12 inches tall to sort of deter that traffic from walking through your beds. Think also, though, in terms of what the reflective surface may be. Along a sidewalk, you may get a lot of heat that can reflect and bounce back onto the plants and cause stress. So if it's a hot space where there's a lot of that reflection, do build your beds a little taller, at least 1 to 2 foot tall. Now I'm going to go through a couple bed examples. On each one of these slides, you'll see a website listed where you can go and get the actual bed design. This first bed is a very common model that we see. There's a lot of different designs out there, so just pick one that works for you. But this bed here is a 4x8 that is 24 inches tall. So there's corner supports that are drilled into. I would also recommend, for sure, if you get any longer than 8 foot, to also put a center support in the middle of that long beam. So if you do a 12 or a 10-foot bed, add that support. That'll help keep those boards from warping. Here's another design where they're just using timbers, possibly a little bit cheaper to construct if you can get your hands on these. I would recommend staggering them to create better support. Here's a design that will be good for wheelchairs or for people who are standing that have that hard time bending over. It's a tabletop design. This is an example of one that's 3 by 10 foot, and it's 32, it could even be as tall as 38 inches tall, depending on your users. Just put it at their waistline. Keep in mind now that this is a 2 by 12 running across the frame at the top. And in this situation, you're only going to be able to have about 9.5 inches of soil. So you're going to have to stick to crops that have that shallower root system. Salad greens or radishes or anything that's a shallow root crop, maybe a beet, would work well in this space. Something like a tomato won't grow very well because it has a very deep root system, and it probably won't be happy in this type of a garden. When you're building your bed, there's a lot of options as far as the materials that you can use. You could use rot-resistant lumbers such as cedar or redwood. They tend to be a little bit more expensive. I do get questions that arise about the use of treated lumber in vegetable beds. What people are often referring to is the old common wood preservative traditionally used. It was chromated copper arsenate, or CCA. That was phased out in 2003 and is virtually unavailable for residential uses. So really that's not a concern anymore. There's 2 other products now on the market, ammoniacal copper zinc arsenate, or ACZA, and ammoniacal copper quat, ACQ, have replaced CCA and may be safely used in raised bed construction. There's well-documented research, such as by Texas A&M, that has shown that these are safe and can be used to construct vegetable beds. So there's really insignificant movement of the chemicals into the soil, and so you can consider using these safely. But do avoid using railroad ties unless they're extremely well weathered. They are not a good choice because they are treated with creosote, and this can leach into the soil and it's toxic to plants. It'll actually kill the plants in your garden bed. So unless you can find some really old discarded tiers that are, or ties that are not oozing anything, you don't see any black sticky substance oozing out, or you don't smell anything, I wouldn't use them. Now, if you are unsure about the safety of the lumber, one thing that you could do is put a plastic liner around the sides of your garden to separate the soil from the wood material on the outside. And this will prevent the roots from contacting the wood. Be careful not to tear the plastic when you're cultivating in there or when you're building your beds. And don't put the plastic along the bottom of the garden, because we do need the water to leach out of the base. We don't want to create an enclosed container of plastic. We want the water to be able to drain. Some other options for materials: you could use something like a cement block or a paver or bricks to build your beds, but do keep in mind that with cement, over time, your pH will begin to raise as like limestone material, for example, could leach into the soil. And if our pH gets too high, our plants will not grow very well. Another option that you can see photoed there, Lowell Elementary school garden in Sioux Falls used wading pools. These wading pools are best for, again, those shallow-rooted crops, things like radishes, lettuce, beets I mentioned, things that aren't going to go very deep into the soil, because that wading pool, you can only get a few inches of soil in there. These wading pools were left outside and they lasted for about 3 years, and then they really started to become broken and fragile. As far as soils, you see all sorts of recommended mixes out there, and what I'll tell you is there's many combinations of growing media that are going to be good options for your raised beds. There's not just this one perfect soil mix, so many different options, and just find a recommendation from an extension website out there, because that's something that's been tested and examined. But a couple of combinations that I'll present here are something like a 1/3 of the soil volume from the bed's root zone should be soil. So you could do 1/3 soil, and then 1/3 compost or peat for that organic matter, and then 1/3 sand. Mix that up very well before you put it into the garden bed. Don't make layers of this. Mix it up and then put it into the garden bed so that it's even and consistent throughout. Another recommendation is to just change that slightly so that you have 1/4 organic material. So again, peat moss or compost, and then 1/4 sand or perlite, and 1/2 soil. And I will tell you that also in Sioux Falls at the school gardens that we've worked with, we've done half soil, half compost, and we've had decent results with that soil mix as well. Prepare that mix so that the mediums are evenly mixed together and distributed within the bed, and then put that into the bed. Keep in mind that every year that soil is going to settle somewhat, so you'll have to add a good 2 to 4 inches annually to restore what has been depleted from the garden bed. Feel free to contact me about this topic or other topics related to school and community garden. Thank you for watching this iGrow podcast.